You can see that below these parameters, controlling the size of the icon, then you have control over the actual elements of it, and you can see you can show the logo or the icon, and you've got tick boxes for each one, so you can actually disable the display of the icon, or you can disable the display of the logo. It's up to you really. It's not really an issue most of the time, so you generally would leave those turned on. And you can see the final parameters in this particular rollout are quantity multiplier. Now, this is quite an important concept in particle flow, and basically what happens is that when you're working with particles, you may be working with, let's say, 5,000 particles, and particle flow works with particles in the viewport differently to the way it does at render time. It can have two different setups basically for each type. The advantage of that is obviously in the viewport you want generally to have pretty interactive feedback if at all possible. So generally you will work with less particles in the viewport than you will at render time. Then of course at render time you want the full effect of the particles, so you have the normal amount. So you can see this is reflected here with the default values. The viewport percentage is 50% and the render time values are 100%. So in this way you can actually control the percentage of particles that are seen in the viewport at render time. And that's a very useful tool. You could have 1,000,000 particles, you could be working with 1,000,000 particles in the viewport, and of course you don't really want to see those. That's going to take quite a while to display. So what you do is you actually set the percentage in the viewport to, let's say, 0.1% or 1% of 1,000,000, and you'll get a relatively small percentage then, and that would actually probably be usable, and you'd get reasonable feedback. The other flip side of this is that you could actually, if you wanted to, have more particles in the viewport than you had at render time. It's completely flexible. Or you could say that at render time you want 200% or 400%, 500% of the particles that you would actually see in the viewport. When you do that, particle flow uses the random number generators that are used without the entire system, and it'll just generate more particles based on those. So you'll get the same kind of effect, but obviously with a much denser collection of particles. Okay, so let's move on to selection. Now, if I just close this down and open up selection, you can see with selection, this is a very useful tool, but you don't use it that often. It's generally only used when you have problems with particles or you want to work with them in a very specific way. So if I run the particle flow a few frames forward, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to make the particles move a little bit more slowly, and this will bunch them up a bit more so I can show this off to a little bit of a greater effect. Actually, I'll just knock that down even further. There we go. So I'll let the particles emit, and you can see we've got a little cloud of particles now floating. So as I said, there are some operators that can actually do things with particles. As an example, a delete operator can do that. So let's put in a delete operator in here. We'll just jump ahead a little bit. And I'm just going to put a delete operator into this event, and I'm going to say I want to just delete the selected particles. So we haven't got any particles selected at the moment, so it does nothing. But of course, we can select particles. So if I click on this icon here, that will put us into sub-object particle mode. And you can see there's a second sub-object mode called event. But you can actually get to the same place by clicking on the plus icon in the modifier window, and you can see we've got the same levels. We've got particle and event. So the way particle works is that we can just manually select particles just by selecting them like this. There we go. I'm just dragging boxes around, and you can see it's just selecting particles. If I click off them, you can see it just deselects them all again, so you can see all your particles. And you can see when I'm selecting the particles, this operator then makes sense. It actually has some particles to delete because they're selected. So you can see that's basically how selecting particles is useful. And there are other operators that actually can work with selections as well. So it's not just deleting particles. So I'll just get the particle selection back. Now, one of the options that you have is selecting particles by its particle ID, and you can see this option here. We could type in a value. We could say let's go to the 5th particle, and we'll add that to the selection. When I do so, I don't know if you noticed, but a little particle here disappeared. That obviously was particle number 5. So I'll just remove that. We'll put it back. And I'm going to use one of the features of the display operator, and I'm going to actually show particle IDs. So there you are. You can actually see the numbers now. But we don't really need that for now, so I'll just turn that off again. Now, every time I pick another ID and click on add, it adds that ID to the selection, and you can see the particle disappears. Okay, there we go. Now, you don't always want this to be the case. You may want it to be an exclusive selection. So the other option you can use is you can say clear selection, and every time you add an ID, it'll remove all the other IDs from the selection. So if I click that now, you can see all the other particles reappear. And if I go to, say, 32, you'll see 32 disappears and the other particle reappears, because it's, you know, the selection buffer, as it was, is flushed on each occasion, and you get your particles deselected and just ID 32 is reselected. So you can see, you know, you've got quite a few ways there of actually selecting particles. It's quite flexible in that respect. Now, another option is to actually select particles based on events. So I'm just going to quickly show you how that works. At the moment, I've got two display operators, and you can see the two display operators are basically the same. They're both displaying the particles as ticks, these little cross shapes, and they're both using a kind of purpley color. So I've actually got a test here, and that test to see if the particles, as I showed earlier, are older than frames 25 to 35 frames old. When that happens, they then get passed to the second event, and they look exactly the same. So actually, I'm just going to get rid of this position object operator. Just select and delete it. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the color on the particles. There we go. And I'm also going to change the shape on the particles to diamonds. So you can see now it becomes a little bit more obvious that actually we have particles within two different events, because the display operator for each event is displaying the particles in a different way. Now, this will make it easier to demonstrate what I'm going to do next, which is actually select particles based on the event. So if I go to event mode and select one of the particles, you can see they've all gone red. Now, you would expect them to also disappear because they've been selected. But this is a peculiarity of the event selection system, where you can either select a particle and all the other particles in the event will be selected, or you can actually use this list here, and actually, well, you know, that will list all of the events in your system. And if I just change the color on this to green, because it's not very evident that we're getting a selection, because obviously we're using red. That red is the selection color. So now if I go back and forth between the two, you can see I'm selecting, or rather I'm flagging the particles in each event to be selected. Once you've done this, you can go back to particle level, and you can actually say get from event level, and that will now actually select the particles from the previous from the event level. So in that way, you know, as I'll just show you that again, I'll just flag these, go to the particle level, and then get from event level. There we go, and you can see that when I did that, it cleared the previous selection. So, you know, you can either select particles explicitly by, you know, doing so in the viewport using IDs, or by using events. So, you know, you've got quite a lot of flexibility in that respect. So I'll just clear the selection, and I'll just click that off again. And let's go on to have a look at the system management rollout. Okay, as you can imagine, with a name like system management, we've got some pretty important parameters in this rollout. The first parameter is called upper limit, and that's got a very strong effect on your particle system. For each source that you have in your scene, this controls the total number of particles that system can hold at any one time. So if you've emitted, as you can see, the default value is 100,000. If you've emitted 100,000 particles, your system hasn't got any room for any more, and it will not birth any more particles or spawn any more particles, and this can cause quite a few problems when you're working with a particle system. So the default is set at 100,000, and you know, quite commonly in a lot of particle systems, 100,000 isn't really that many. So generally, what I do is I set the upper limit to its maximum. You know, just dial in 99999 and press enter, and there you get the absolute limit. That is the maximum limit you can ever have, and you can see it's a ridiculous number, like 100 million or something, or 100 billion, something silly, quite a few noughts there, and that will free you up. Now generally, you know, your memory can become an issue when you don't limit particles, but that's another issue altogether, and it's quite disconcerting to be working with a particle flow and have operators spawning more particles, and you get nothing. There aren't any particles being spawned, and that can quite often be the reason for it, is the upper limit is set at 100,000 or less. So as I said, just set it to